People very frequently talk about how Slim Shady simply could not exist the way the character did in the 90s and 2000s today because he simply pushes the boundaries too much for the modern climate. People say all the time, if they think this is bad, imagine when they hear Guilty Conscious, or you simply could not release the song Kim today, even if it won a Grammy 20 years ago. The fascinating thing about the Death of Slim Shady is that the album literally proves that to be true, but that is also integral to the concept of the album. The great, and I mean great, majority of the lyrical content on this project is straight up rage bait. Eminem has always said controversial things, but we've arguably never heard him say controversial statements as matter-of-factly as we do here.
Oh. Call me a transphobe, really? Cause I just can't go and try and pretend you was never a man though. Sorry, I mean damn bro, yeah, it's just the way I feel.
He specifically and intentionally handpicks certain subjects that are topical and cause the most outrage when discussed now. Although he still makes it entertaining and often silly, so much of the content on this album is outwardly rage bait. But that makes the narrative work because it does the perfect job of painting Slim Shady as both a villain and the polar opposite of Eminem. Eminem has expressed primarily left-leaning ideologies when he isn't playing his controversial character. Despite how disliked and admittedly not good most of his politically focused music is, if you actually take a single second to read his stances and the majority of what he would discuss, he basically always has a liberal perspective on it. One of his children has even come out publicly as identifying as non-binary, and although Eminem has never openly spoken about that, it is most likely he was totally supportive of it. Said non-binary child appears in a music video and is talked about on this album with a lot of anti-transgender rhetoric. The point I'm making is that Slim Shady completely contrasts Marshall Mathers as a person, which gives Marshall a motive to hate that part of him. The current political climate is, for the most part, primarily focused on the subjects brought up on the Death of Slim Shady, and what this album does so well is make it clear that Slim Shady is both the polar opposite of the popular opinion, but also the polar opposite of Eminem's. That's where the conflict comes from, and that's why the concept works. Eminem does not want Slim Shady to exist because he represents what he dislikes about himself. He's a character that he created to cope with his difficult upbringing and to cover his insecurities with a rough exterior.
When it was you and me, yeah, I gave you power to use me as an excuse to be evil. I know. You created me to say everything you didn't have the balls to say.
On top of that, the modern climate simply cannot handle, and doesn't really need, a character like Slim Shady. So this album's purpose was to thoroughly and excruciatingly explain why Slim Shady no longer belongs, and that it's time to lay him to rest as just a part of Eminem's and rap's history. I would also like to comment on a common critique of this project, both because I think it has a lot to do with what I'm currently discussing, and also because I think there are just some people simply getting a lot of things wrong. A lot of people dislike that the whole angle of this project is Gen Z wants to cancel Eminem, when realistically, that just quite frankly is not happening. There are some young people that do hear Eminem's old work and think it's disgusting and he should face repercussions for it, but that's a surprisingly small number of people. Most people are cool with Eminem, or they don't like him because they think he's cringe, and that's it. And I do agree that Eminem's previous responses to Gen Z are just silly. I am not entirely a delusional Eminem stan that will just outwardly defend everything he does. Trust me, he has albums that I think suck so bad they would not get a video like this, and I do think a lot of M's new material where he addresses the new generation does sound simply ridiculous. But I also completely disagree with that criticism being applied to this album because of the context that's on this album. This album is telling a story in a fictional universe. It is very much not a response or addressment of the rapper's current predicament. In this story, everything that Eminem/Slim Shady is saying on the record is said unironically, and the public is hearing it without the story context that we have. If the biggest rapper of all time was saying all of this stuff unironically, that would genuinely cause a cancellation attempt. When Eminem talks about being cancelled on this project, he isn't talking about our real life, it's his perspective in-universe when Slim Shady is purposely trying to tarnish his image to the max.
I said drink it, bitch. The fuck? The fuck are you trying to do? Get us cancelled.
Therefore, that lyrical content that addresses the young folk that are cancelling him is actually completely appropriate and makes sense. I think some people are either struggling to or choosing to ignore the context provided by the story of the album to make him look like an old man yelling at the sky. With that being said, if you still don't like the narrative or concept, or if you think it was poorly executed for another reason, that's totally cool. I am not here to tell anyone what to think, simply that I think there are people being pretty unfair about the intent behind the material. Despite my enjoyment of it, it's not at all hard for me to admit that this album is not perfect. The main problem with this project for me comes down to consistency, and unfortunately it would have been a very easy problem to fix. From the start up until Guilty Conscious 2, the concept and story is very beautifully executed. The dichotomy between Eminem and Slim Shady is explored and explained, and it results in arguably the best song on the album. But after that point, the narrative almost entirely fizzles out. Temporary and Somebody Save Me are both solid inclusions to the tracklist because it humanizes Eminem, who despite being a real person is also one of our two characters in this story. And you can make the argument that Toby features enough related lyrical content in M's verse to be thematically appropriate. But Head Honcho and Bad One, even if they're decent songs, add absolutely nothing to the story. Which absolutely sucks, because this is irrefutably Eminem's best album from a conceptual perspective, because Eminem's previous albums don't really have much of a concrete concept. If those two tracks were just cut and saved as bonus tracks or for a deluxe version, the narrative would have been so much tighter and so much more satisfying. There are other shortcomings to the project as well, a major one being the repetition of certain jokes and subjects. Although the anti-woke material is very integral to the concept, there is a little too much of it. That's not because it's too offensive, a lot of it is actually somewhat tame or just forgettable, it merely gets irritating to hear such similar bars over and over. The amount of times Caitlyn Jenner is brought up on this album is bafflingly stupid. But with those complaints being said, this is Eminem's most interesting project sonically since pretty much Relapse. The production on this album has such a wonderful blend of the best elements of Eminem's past work, with a fresh and dark aesthetic as well. There are a lot of songs that sound like the early days of Eminem to make it cohesive with the narrative about Slim Shady, and they sound fantastic.
With balls in his do-rag, he sags, fearing no man. He stands pen in his hand like Edward Scissorhands, who slices competition and just goes about his business.
They have that nastiness that made Slim so memorable, but nothing sounds too much like rehashing old ideas. Except for the track that most people believe to be the scrapped Christopher Reeves track from the original version of Encore, and it certainly sounds like that era, and I really love this one and how playful it is. The closer, with a sample from Jelly Roll, sounds like Eminem's best moments from his work in the 2010s. It sounds like what Revival should have sounded like all the way through. Even if this album doesn't compete with Eminem's original 3-album run, I would argue that the best parts of Eminem's abilities and catalog are pretty present and explored on the Death of Slim Shady. There are also some fantastic features on the tracklist. JID and Eminem has been a dream collaboration of mine for a couple years, and it did not disappoint. Hearing them go bar for bar and both delivering an incredible rapping performance was great. Sly Piper and White Gold both have 2 performances on this project, and I'd definitely say they both contribute a lot to their respective tracks. Big Sean went crazy on his verse on Toby and was arguably the highlight of that track. Most importantly to me when talking about features is Skylar Grey, who every single Eminem fan that made fun of her owes an apology to. Her performance is so unspeakably beautiful and evokes so much emotion as soon as she begins singing. She has such an incredible talent that deserves more respect for her abilities. The 2 features that don't stand out as anything special to me personally are Easy Mill and Babytron. I think they're both talented rappers, and I do not doubt they're going to have some big hits in the very near future, but neither of them are all that memorable to me on this project. And Bizarre might just be the worst rapper of all time, and I do not understand how his verse was included on this album. He is so lucky that the beat went as hard as it did during his time on the mic. M's flows on this project are very slick and exhilarating, although he does occasionally fall back into habits that I'm not a big fan of, primarily the choppy staccato flow he's been doing for a while now. He also pulls off some flows and cadences I feel like I'm not used to hearing from him. For example, the final verse on Road Rage has a really smooth flow with the repeated use of a huh sound that comes off so naturally and works great. Some old habits do also die hard in Eminem's pen game with some pretty cringe and unnecessary punchlines and jokes. The first verse on Bad One with all the Marvel jokes is legitimately hard to listen to because of how pointless and goofy it is. But overall, I actually think this is the most focused Eminem has been in the last decade. He had a great idea for an LP and he pulled it off amazingly with his abilities as a lyricist, and I think it's pretty goddamn great. The Death of Slim Shady, in my opinion at the very least, is a marvelous body of work and a satisfying send-off to the character Slim Shady. It's not my album of the year per se. I think Quedeca's Scrapyard is better, I think the Vampire Weekend record is better, I think Lupe and Charlie XCX both have pretty strong competitors there, but I really liked it, and I am so grateful that this album didn't suck. It was so unbelievably possible that this album would suck, so I feel very fortunate. There are problems that I would say hold it back from being as fantastic as it could be, but ultimately, I really loved it as an Eminem fan. The aesthetic is dark and interesting, the story is engaging, there are some bops that are fun, there are standout features, and it has emotional beats that are very effective. I know that if you say anything good about new Eminem, you will be accused of glazing, but you know what? So be it. That's okay with me. I adored this album, and for me, it is pretty handedly top 5 in the rapper's catalog.